You've probably imagined it before. What you'd be like with more money. You picture yourself calmer, kinder, even. Still you, just with fewer problems weighing you down. But the real reason behind that assumption is far more interesting than the assumption itself. Because the research on wealth and empathy tells a very different story. Not a story about greedy villains in movies, twirling a mustache over a pile of gold. A quieter, stranger story about what money actually does to the brain, without you ever noticing it happen to you. Picture a busy intersection. Cars stop near a crosswalk. A pedestrian steps out, clearly waiting for their turn to cross the street. A psychologist named Paul Piff, working out of UC Berkeley at the time, sat near an intersection just like this one and watched. For several weekends, his research team crouched nearby and rated each car that passed, 1 to 5, based roughly on its price and condition. A beat-up old sedan got a 1. A brand-new luxury vehicle got a 5. Then they watched what each driver did the moment a pedestrian stepped into the crosswalk. The pattern that emerged was almost too clean to believe. The more expensive the car, the less likely the driver was to stop and let the pedestrian cross. Some of the priciest cars didn't even slow down at all. Now, one crosswalk on its own doesn't prove much. A single afternoon of traffic could be explained a dozen different ways. Bad drivers having a bad day, distracted commuters running late. Nothing more meaningful than coincidence. So Piff and other researchers kept testing the same idea in different settings, in labs, with strangers, with rigged games involving money, dice, and candy meant for children waiting in another room. In one version of the experiment, participants played a simple board game that had been secretly rigged, so one player would always end up with far more fake money than the other. The winning player hadn't earned the advantage through any skill. It was handed to them by the setup of the game itself. Within minutes, researchers noticed something odd. The player who'd been handed the advantage started behaving differently, talking more, moving their game pieces more forcefully, even reaching for a bowl of pretzels set nearby, as if it belonged to them alone. A brief, artificial taste of wealth was enough to change how someone carried themselves toward the person sitting right across the table. The results kept lining up in the same direction. People who were made to feel wealthy, even briefly, through something as simple as a board game rigged in their favor, started behaving less generously toward the person sitting across the table. Not because they were suddenly bad people. Something about the feeling of having more seemed to quietly turn the volume down on caring about everyone else in the room. Here's where this gets specific enough to actually matter to you. Researchers studying facial expressions found something almost mechanical happening in wealthier participants. Higher income was linked to a measurably reduced ability to accurately read other people's emotions just from their face. Not because wealthier people are less intelligent, and not because they're trying to ignore anyone on purpose. According to the theory behind the finding, when you don't need other people to survive or get ahead, your brain simply stops investing energy in reading them closely. It's not cruelty. It's economy. Your brain is just spending its attention somewhere else. That connects to something sometimes called the mirror neuron system, and here's the plain English version of what that actually means. These are neurons that fire both when you do something yourself and when you simply watch someone else do that same thing. They're part of how humans instinctively feel what another person might be feeling, almost like a built-in rehearsal space for empathy running quietly in the background of your mind. A neuroscientist named Sukhvinder Obi at McMaster University ran experiments measuring activity in that exact system using tools that track the brain's response in real time. Higher status and higher power measurably reduced activation in the parts of the brain tied to mirroring someone else's actions. In plain terms, the wealthier and more powerful someone felt in the moment, the less their brain automatically stepped into another person's shoes. Does that mean money makes you a worse person the second it arrives in your account? Not exactly, and this is the part worth slowing down for. What the research actually points to is something closer to this. Dependence builds empathy. When you need people, your brain pays close attention to them, their moods, their reactions, whether they seem upset or pleased with you in a given moment. Wealth, especially the kind that buys you distance from other people, quietly removes that need. Bigger houses set further apart. Private schools with smaller, more selective circles. Fewer everyday moments where your outcome actually depends on reading a stranger correctly and responding well. There's a physical layer underneath all of this too. One that shows up even before anyone consciously decides how to react. One study measured activity in the vagus nerve, a nerve tied closely to the body's emotional and physical response to seeing someone else in distress. Lower-income participants showed a noticeably stronger vagus nerve response when shown images of other people suffering. Their bodies were more physically moved by someone else's pain, almost before their conscious mind had time to process what they were looking at. So the wiring for empathy doesn't disappear the moment wealth arrives. It just gets less exercise, the same way a muscle weakens when it's rarely used. There's a smaller, everyday version of this same pattern you've probably witnessed yourself without labeling it. Think about tipping behavior at a restaurant. Studies tracking spending habits have repeatedly found that as household income rises, the percentage left as a tip relative to what someone can afford tends to shrink rather than grow. It isn't that wealthier diners can't afford to be generous. It's that the waiter's experience, their mood, their need for that money to matter, simply registers less vividly to someone whose own financial safety no longer depends on strangers being kind back. A separate line of research looked even closer at the ultra-wealthy themselves. A study interviewing dozens of ultra-high net worth individuals, people managing significant fortunes, explored what actually shaped their mindset, their formative years, their decision-making under pressure. One theme kept surfacing across the interviews. Many of these individuals described consciously scheduling time with people outside their financial circle, specifically because they'd noticed their own empathy dulling without it. They weren't waiting to feel generous. They were engineering situations that forced generosity back into practice. That detail matters more than it first seems. It suggests the wealthy people who stay grounded aren't relying on willpower alone. They're relying on structure, on deliberately placing themselves back into rooms where they still need someone. Here's the part almost nobody actually talks about, though. This isn't really a story about villains sitting at the top of the wealth ladder. It's a warning about a mechanism, one quiet enough that it can start working on almost anyone who gains distance from needing other people, long before they'd ever call themselves wealthy. Think about the first time you didn't need to ask a friend for a ride anymore, because you finally had your own car. Think about the moment a promotion meant you no longer had to lean on a coworker's help to get through a hard week. Small losses of dependence. Small, barely noticeable dips in how closely you paid attention to the people standing right next to you. That's the counterintuitive truth worth sitting with for a second. Empathy was never really about how much money sits in your account. It was always about how much you still need other people, day to day, in small and ordinary ways. Which raises an uncomfortable question worth asking yourself honestly. If you're building toward more independence, more comfort, more distance from needing anyone at all, what exactly are you quietly trading away to get there? You don't actually have to trade anything. Not if you catch it in time. There's an interesting counterpoint here worth mentioning, because it complicates the picture in a useful way. Some of the wealthiest people in the world have joined something called the Giving Pledge, publicly committing more than half their fortunes to charitable causes. Researchers studying that pledge have found the motivations behind it are genuinely mixed, part conscience, part public image, sometimes part tax strategy. But the existence of the pledge itself proves something important. The empathy circuitry doesn't vanish permanently. It can be consciously rebuilt, even after distance has quietly worn it down for years. Here's something concrete you can actually use today, not just something to think about. Researchers who study this pattern have found that deliberately putting yourself back into situations of mutual dependence, working closely on a shared project, mentoring someone starting out, leaning on a friend instead of quietly solving everything alone, actually reactivates that empathy circuitry. It's a small, structural fix, not a personality overhaul. Just a decision to stay a little bit dependent on the people around you, on purpose, even when you technically don't have to be. There's a simple version of this you can start this week. Pick one task you'd normally hire out, delegate, or handle entirely alone, and ask someone for help with it directly instead. Not because you can't manage without them. Because the asking itself is what keeps the circuitry warm. It sounds small. It's supposed to be small. The mechanism that dulls empathy works through hundreds of tiny moments of unnecessary independence, so the fix works the same way, through hundreds of tiny moments of chosen dependence instead. Financial writer Morgan Housel, in his book on the psychology of money, makes a related point that fits here more than you'd expect. Wealth, he argues, isn't the same thing as the visible things money buys, the car, the house, the vacations everyone sees. Real wealth is what you don't spend, what stays quiet, what nobody else can see from the outside. Maybe empathy deserves that same framing. The version of you that stays kind isn't the one performing independence for an audience. It's the one who quietly chooses to stay connected to other people, even long after their life no longer technically requires it. So the next time you imagine yourself with more money, picture something a little different than usual. Not just the bigger house, or the smaller, more comfortable circle of people you'll eventually need less. Picture the actual choice sitting right in front of you in that moment. The choice to keep noticing people closely, even once your life stops forcing you to. Because you've probably imagined it before. What you'd be like with more money. Turns out, that was never really a question about your bank balance at all. It was always a question about how much of other people you're still willing to let in, no matter how far you get from needing them.